You really thought she loved you, didn't you? God, everyone here can see it, she was always mine. My brother's voice rang out sharp and cruel across the crowded bar, slicing through the noise of clinking bottles and half-drunk laughter, pulling every pair of eyes onto me like a spotlight I never wanted. And I swear the way the words echoed against the wood-paneled walls felt louder than the jukebox humming an old Springsteen track in the corner, and louder still than the pounding of my own heartbeat as I stood there frozen, a whiskey glass in my hand suddenly too heavy to hold steady, while the laughter that rose in waves around us made me want to vanish into the cracked floorboards. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I muttered out of habit, though in truth those words were a shield, a reflex, the only thing standing between me and the tidal wave of humiliation that had just crashed down. Because nothing in my 36 years on this planet had prepared me for the sting of my own brother Ethan, standing in front of our hometown crowd in Dayton, Ohio, holding the woman I'd once believed was my future like a trophy, grinning as if betrayal were some kind of party trick. And the worst part wasn't even the look on her face, it was the way the room seemed to agree with him. The way every pair of eyes slid off me and onto them like I had already been erased. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 36 years old, born and raised here in Ohio, the kind of town where high school football glory lasts longer than most marriages, and where your reputation is often the only currency you have left. And up until that moment, I'd thought of myself as a man who'd built something, an engineering degree that actually paid, a steady career in project management for a logistics firm, a modest but comfortable townhouse, a future I could see laid out in clean lines. But when your own brother steals the woman you were ready to marry and announces it with a smirk in front of half the damn city, all of that suddenly feels like sand slipping through your fingers. And yet, though I couldn't show it in that moment, I had something none of them knew about. Something Ethan couldn't possibly anticipate. A detail buried deep in the life I'd built quietly, steadily, like reinforcing steel under concrete. And one day, that hidden detail was going to bring the entire structure of his smug little world crashing down. But that night, all I could do was stand there, the taste of cheap bar whiskey coating my tongue, the condensation of the glass wet against my palm, as the symbol of every Carter family gathering, our grandmother's pecan pie recipe, a dish that had followed us through every Thanksgiving, every Christmas. Every damn family reunion flashed through my mind because just last week Ethan had joked about how even the pie was better when he took it first. And it struck me then how he'd been stealing my place, my pride, piece by piece, long before he made his play for Emily, and I realized that pie of all things was going to stick with me as the emblem of this betrayal, though I didn't yet know how it would return to end him. People tell you that betrayal feels like a knife, but it doesn't. It feels like silence after laughter, like the split second when everyone looks away and you're left holding your own dignity like a cracked glass you can't set down. And the thing about being in your 30s is that you're not supposed to crumble anymore. You're supposed to take the hits and keep moving, smile at work the next morning, nod at your boss when he throws another deadline on your plate. Act like you're balancing it all: mortgage, bills, gym membership you hardly use, aging parents who still think you don't call enough. So I swallowed it down, every ounce of rage, every flicker of humiliation, and I turned it into a quiet kind of fuel, the kind you keep burning slow until the right time. Because I learned a long time ago that anger spent too soon is just a gift to the person who wronged you. I remember slipping out of that bar into the cool Ohio night, the streetlights buzzing overhead, my breath fogging in the November air, the sound of a distant freight train rumbling past like it was carrying away the last remnants of my old life. And I thought of a quote I'd once written in the back of my notebook during a miserable all-nighter at the office. "The man who learns to wait owns the future." And I repeated it under my breath, not because I believed it in that moment, but because I needed to, because in a town where everyone knew your business, the only way to survive being gutted in public by your own brother was to decide, right then, that this wasn't the ending, it was the opening move. Ethan had always been jealous. Though he'd never admit it, he'd been the star quarterback in high school, but blew out his knee sophomore year of college. Spent the next decade drifting from job to job, woman to woman, while I was the one grinding, paying bills, fixing mom's leaky roof, covering dad's hospital copays, and I never rubbed it in, never held it over him. But somewhere deep inside, I think he hated that I became the reliable one, the man of the family, while he became the ghost of what could have been. And when Emily came along, a bright, kind, ambitious woman who laughed at my dry humor and once said she admired how steady I was. I should have known that steadiness was exactly what would bore her eventually, that Ethan's recklessness would look like fire next to my stone. But what I didn't know was how low they'd both go to twist the knife. And as I walked to my truck that night, the keys cold in my hand, I promised myself one thing. I wasn't going to let them write me out of my own life. Not without a fight, not without reminding Ethan that some debts come due, not in blood, but in the quiet, merciless balance sheets of truth and consequence. Funny thing is, on the drive home, with the radio low and the smell of stale fast food fries lingering from the bag on the passenger seat, I caught myself smiling, not out of joy, but out of a strange kind of certainty, because I already knew, even then, that Ethan had overlooked something, and that oversight, small as it seemed now, would be the lever I'd use to move the world against him when the time came. I didn't sleep much that night. Just lay there staring at the ceiling fan slicing the dark into pieces, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside my townhouse, the occasional shout of drunk college kids stumbling home from the bar strip 2 blocks over, and I kept replaying Ethan's smirk in my head like a looped reel I couldn't turn off. But the worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the chorus of laughter that had followed, the way my humiliation had become entertainment. And I realized then that humiliation doesn't happen in private. It happens in echo chambers. It multiplies in the mouths and eyes of others, and that's why it burns so deep. By the time the alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m. and I dragged myself out of bed, the taste of whiskey still sour on my tongue, I knew I had to move, to keep going, to show up at work as though nothing had happened. Because if there's one thing I've learned balancing adulthood in this world, it's that bills don't pause for heartbreak, bosses don't care about betrayal, and responsibility doesn't stop piling just because you feel broken inside. So I shaved, pulled on a collared shirt, brewed my usual pot of dark roast coffee, the one ritual that kept me anchored, the smell filling my kitchen with something familiar, grounding, and drove into the logistics firm where I managed a dozen people and 1,000 moving deadlines, and I forced myself to smile when people asked how my weekend was. Though I could already tell the news had started to trickle into the office because gossip in a mid-sized town travels faster than any delivery truck I oversaw. Ethan's name floated around my head even as I stared at spreadsheets, as I listened to conference calls about supply chain bottlenecks and late shipments, and somewhere in the monotony of my job I felt this tiny thread of grim humor. How ironic that I could coordinate pallets of goods across 4 states, track shipments down to the minute, yet couldn't see my own brother sneaking into my life and stealing the woman I loved. And I muttered under my breath as I clicked through emails. Trust is the most expensive currency you'll ever spend. And once it's gone, no one gives you a refund. And I wrote it on a sticky note, just like I used to scribble quotes when I needed to remind myself that pain could be turned into something sharper. At lunch, sitting in the break room with the microwave smell of leftover spaghetti in the air, I scrolled through my phone and saw the first photo Ethan and Emily, arms wrapped around each other at that same bar. Someone had snapped it and posted with a caption that said, "Carter boys keeping it in the family," followed by laughing emojis, and I felt my stomach drop. Not just at the image, but at the realization that I wasn't just betrayed, I was ridiculed, turned into a meme in my own town, the kind of joke people would whisper about when I walked into the grocery store or sat at the diner counter. And that's when I understood that revenge wasn't just about balancing scales. It was about reclaiming identity, about refusing to let someone else define the story they thought they'd written for me. Ethan wasn't just my brother. He was the golden child turned disappointment, the family's great hope turned liability, and somewhere along the way I had let my role as the responsible one become invisible, taken for granted, because when you're the one paying the bills, fixing the leaks, showing up every time someone else falls short, people stop noticing. It becomes expected. And that's the trap. You're invisible until you fail, and then suddenly the whole world sees you. I thought about Mom that afternoon, how she used to say, "Family's the only thing that matters." Even when Ethan blew rent money on poker or disappeared for weeks without calling. And I wondered if she'd defend him now, if she'd tell me blood was thicker than water while pretending not to see the blood he'd drawn from me. And the thought twisted something in my chest because loyalty had always been my compass. And now it felt like it had guided me straight into a swamp. That evening I drove out to the edge of town where the cornfields stretch for miles and the sky opens up like a dome. And I parked my truck on the side of the gravel road, just to breathe, to get away from the weight of eyes. And I sat there watching the sun sink orange over the fields, The smell of harvested earth thick in the air, and I said out loud to no one. Sometimes the only way to fix betrayal is to let it rot long enough until it poisons the betrayer. And I surprised myself with how calm my voice sounded, because even though the rage was still a live wire inside me, something colder was beginning to take shape, something deliberate. The next week was a blur of pretending at work, pretending on calls with mom, pretending when old high school buddies texted to ask if it was true, and each time I felt the old part of me, the steady, reliable, forgiving part, die a little more. In its place grew this sharpness, this patience I didn't know I had because I started remembering small things. Things Ethan would never suspect mattered. The joint bank account he once begged me to help him set up when he was between jobs. The copy of his driver's license I still had from when he needed a cosigner, the digital paper trail of all the times he'd leaned on me to cover his failures. And I knew then that he had overlooked the most dangerous detail of all, that I knew him better than anyone. And that meant I knew where the cracks in his armor were, the kind of cracks he couldn't patch with charm or lies. Back at the office, I worked later hours, partly to avoid going home to an empty townhouse, partly because burying myself in the rhythm of supply chains and deadlines gave me a sense of control. And one night, as I stared at the screen, half-empty coffee cooling beside me, I laughed bitterly at the irony that logistics, my entire career, was about finding efficiency, eliminating waste, closing gaps, and here I was, staring at the biggest inefficiency of my life. The years wasted on loyalty to a brother who would sell me out for applause. On Friday, my coworkers invited me out for drinks again. Same bar, same neon lights buzzing over the entrance, and I said no, because I wasn't ready to walk back into the lion's den. Not yet, not until I could turn the tables, not until I could walk in with something they didn't expect. But as I sat home alone with takeout Chinese and the muted sound of a basketball game on TV, I realized that revenge wasn't going to be fast. It wasn't going to be about one dramatic gesture. It was going to be about patience, about setting the trap piece by piece. Because if Ethan had taught me anything, it was that he only respected spectacle, and if I wanted to cut him down, it would have to be in the same arena where he'd humiliated me. Public, undeniable, irreversible. And so, late that night, with the smell of lo mein and soy sauce still heavy in the air, I pulled out an old notebook, the one I'd once used to track side projects, hustles I never finished, and I wrote one word on the first page in thick black ink: balance. Not revenge, not justice, but balance, because that's what betrayal does. It tilts the scales, makes you feel like gravity itself is rigged against you, and the only way to breathe again is to find the counterweight, no matter how heavy it has to be. The weekend after that humiliation was the longest of my life, stretched thin by silence and the constant buzz of my phone with notifications I refused to check, because every time I caught a glimpse of the screen, there was another message, another tagged photo, another reminder that I had been made into a spectacle. And I realized how fast your life can turn into a punchline in the age of social media. How betrayal in the digital era doesn't just wound you, it brands you, stamps your humiliation onto a feed that never forgets. I drove out to my parents' house on Sunday, a modest single-story ranch on the edge of town, paint peeling on the shutters, lawn kept neat by Dad's obsessive weekend routine. And I knew walking up those steps that I was about to step into the lion's den, because Mom had called the night before, her voice cautious, her words threaded with that tone I knew too well. The one that said she already chose sides without admitting it, and when she opened the door and hugged me, I could feel the tension in her shoulders, as if embracing me too warmly might betray Ethan. And sure enough, when I walked into the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table with Emily beside him, her hand resting on his knee like she had been doing it for years. And the sight made my stomach twist. Not just because they were together, but because they had claimed the kitchen, the heart of the house, the place where every Carter holiday had played out, where Grandma's pecan pie once cooled on the counter, where laughter and arguments had always mixed with the smell of coffee and fried eggs, and now they sat there like they owned it, like I was the intruder. And Mom's eyes darted nervously between us as she fussed with the coffee maker, while Dad just sat in his recliner in the adjoining room, TV muted but sports highlights flashing across the screen, his silence speaking louder than anything he could have said. Ethan leaned back, smirking like he had the upper hand even in my parents' kitchen, and he said, "You gonna keep sulking, Danny, or are you finally gonna man up and admit she chose who she really wanted?" And the words cut sharper than they should have, Not because I believed them, but because I could see in Mom's hesitant glance, in Dad's refusal to look at me, that some part of them wanted me to swallow it, to accept this twisted version of family loyalty. And I realized in that moment that betrayal isn't just about losing love. It's about watching the people you trusted choose comfort over truth, silence over justice. And it hurt worse than I thought it would, because loyalty had always been my compass, and suddenly I was standing in a house where that compass spun uselessly in every direction. I didn't answer Ethan, not then, because I knew words would only feed him, and instead I poured myself a mug of coffee, inhaled the familiar bitter scent, and I sat at the counter with it, sipping slowly, using the ritual to anchor myself. And I remembered what I'd written in my notebook balance, and I thought, this is part of it, this silence, this swallowing, because patience is the first brick in any plan worth building. Emily tried to catch my eye, maybe to gauge whether I hated her or pitied her, but I gave her nothing because I'd already decided she was just a pawn in a much larger game. And Ethan, well, Ethan had always been the kind of man who mistook silence for weakness, and that was going to be his undoing. After a strained half hour, I left, stepping back into the cold November air, the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke clinging to me, and as I drove away, I thought about the years I'd carried this family, covering Ethan's mistakes, loaning him money, showing up when no one else would, and I realized that maybe my greatest flaw wasn't loyalty. It was enabling, because when you carry someone long enough, they start to believe they're entitled to the ground beneath your feet. And Ethan had built his entire identity on taking what wasn't his, convinced the world owed him because of what he'd lost when that knee injury killed his dreams. And maybe that was his surface motive, chasing what he thought should have been his all along. But deep down, I knew there was something darker driving him, a resentment that I'd become the man he thought he was supposed to be, a bitterness he could never admit out loud. And Emily was just the most convenient weapon he could find. That night I sat on my couch with a glass of bourbon, the TV flickering silently, and I thought about everything I'd given up for stability, the long hours at work, the promotions I'd fought tooth and nail for, the friends I'd drifted from because I was too tired to keep up, the vacations I never took because I was saving for a future that just evaporated, and I realized the irony. I had sacrificed spontaneity for security, and in doing so I'd handed Ethan the one angle he could exploit, because Emily wanted fire, and I gave her stone, and Ethan, reckless and unreliable, was fire incarnate. But fire burns out fast and stone endures, and that was the metaphor I clung to as I scribbled in my notebook, pouring bourbon-stained words across the page, because I needed to remind myself that endurance outlasts spectacle, and when the time came, I would prove it. The days that followed blurred together, work and obligations blending into one long performance where I played the part of the unshaken man. But at night, I studied old receipts, shared accounts, favors Ethan had begged, contracts he'd signed without reading, all the tiny overlooked details of a life lived carelessly, and I began to see the outlines of a trap forming. Like blueprints only I could read, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that the same precision I used to track shipments and schedules could dismantle a man piece by piece if applied with patience. One Friday evening, after another exhausting week, I drove out to the local gym, the one I used to frequent more in my 20s, and I ran on the treadmill until my lungs burned, until sweat stung my eyes. And it wasn't about fitness, it was about control, about proving to myself that I could still push past pain, that I wasn't broken. And as I cooled down, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, hair damp with sweat, eyes hard. And I thought, this is what rebirth looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, but quiet and relentless. And I felt a strange surge of power because even if Ethan thought he'd broken me, I was already rebuilding brick by brick. On the way home, I stopped at the diner I'd been going to since high school, slid into a booth, ordered black coffee and a slice of pecan pie, and when the waitress set it down in front of me, I stared at it for a long moment, the flaky crust, the sticky sweet filling. And I knew it was more than dessert, it was a symbol, a reminder that even traditions can be weaponized, that even the simplest things carry weight if you're willing to give them meaning. And I smiled faintly, not because I enjoyed the taste, but because I already saw how it would all circle back in the end. Driving home, headlights cutting through the dark, I thought about something my father once said when I was a teenager working on my first car. Every machine fails where the pressure's uneven. And I realized the same was true for people, for families, for relationships apply, pressure at the right fault line, and the whole thing shatters. And that became my philosophy, my strategy, my comfort. because I knew where Ethan's pressure points were and I was ready to press. It's strange how quickly betrayal becomes background noise when you live in a town like Dayton, because after the first wave of laughter, the jokes dull into whispers, and then those whispers become silence. The kind where people don't quite meet your eyes at the grocery store or the gas station because they've already moved on to the next scandal. But for you, the wound is still bleeding, and I carried that silence like a weight through December. Showing up at work each day, logging long hours as holiday shipments backed up, while outside the world was glittering with Christmas lights and false cheer, and every billboard screamed about joy and family, words that felt like acid in my throat. Ethan and Emily, meanwhile, seemed to take every chance to flaunt their new reality. Photos surfacing of them at tree lightings, holding hands at the ice rink, even one where they stood in front of the same diner I'd eaten pie in just nights before, smiling like they were in a Hallmark movie, and each image was another knife, but I swallowed them one by one. Because I knew their showboating wasn't strength, it was desperation, an attempt to cement their narrative before mine could rise, and I let them have their little victories, because endurance outlasts spectacle, and I was building something that didn't need a stage, not yet. Still, the loneliness cut deeper in the quiet moments, coming home to a dark townhouse, heating up leftovers in the microwave, scrolling through my phone only to close it in disgust because every app seemed to echo their names. And I caught myself some nights just driving, circling the outskirts of town with the radio low, headlights cutting through the frost, coffee steaming in the cup holder, the hum of the engine the only steady sound. And in those drives I thought about how adulthood in this world feels like running on a treadmill set. Just a little too fast, you keep up until you stumble. And when you stumble, no one slows it down for you. They just watch you fall, and Ethan had taken advantage of that stumble. But what he didn't know was that I'd already found the emergency stop switch, and one day soon I'd use it. At work, the pressure mounted year-end deadlines, a new manager from corporate riding us hard. Everyone stressed and snapping, but strangely, I found myself calmer than I'd been in years because compared to betrayal, no spreadsheet could scare me. And in that calm I started to sharpen, to notice details I might have missed before. And one day, as I sorted through personal paperwork I kept in my desk drawer, old tax forms, loan agreements, I came across the file from years back when Ethan had begged me to co-sign his car loan after his credit tanked. And I remembered how he'd promised he'd keep up with payments, how I'd stupidly trusted him, and how I'd ended up covering months when he defaulted. And I realized that piece of paper was still mine, still bearing both our names, and my lips curled into a grim smile because it was proof, leverage, the kind of overlooked detail that could be turned into a weapon, and I thought, every careless man leaves receipts, and one day those receipts will bury him. The irony was, while I was rediscovering patience and precision, Ethan was speeding headfirst into spectacle, because right after New Year's, he threw a party big, loud, messy, the kind where half the town shows up just to drink his booze and gawk, and of course Emily was there, draped over him like a prize, and when the photos hit social media, it wasn't just a party, it was a statement, a victory lap in my face. And though it stung, it also told me something important. He needed validation, needed eyes on him, needed to win in the court of public opinion, and that need was a weakness because when you're addicted to applause, you'll never see the knife until it's in your back. I kept my distance physically, but mentally, I was everywhere tracking, noting, piecing together, and I started to map out not just his movements, but his patterns, his flaws, because revenge, I realized, is like logistics. It isn't about rage, it's about planning routes, choosing the right time for delivery, and I knew I was getting closer to mine. By mid-January, snow coated the streets, salt crunching under tires, the air sharp and dry, and on one of those nights, alone in my kitchen with a steaming mug of coffee, I wrote another line in my notebook. Some men burn fast, but the man who waits controls the ashes. And as I set the pen down, I felt it settle into my bones, because I could already sense the fire Ethan was stoking would one day collapse under its own weight, and all I had to do was be ready with the water or the gasoline. January bled into February, and with it came that restless Ohio winter rhythm days of pale gray light, the kind where snow doesn't fall so much as hover in the air like suspended dust. And I found myself spending more time at the gym, because iron never lies. The barbell always tells you exactly where you stand. And there was something clean about that truth after months of being gaslit by my own brother and my ex-fiancée. So I went heavier, longer, pushing until my hands were raw, until sweat pooled on the mat and the sound of clanging plates drowned out the static in my chest. Meanwhile, Ethan was doing the opposite, turning every moment of his life into a curated stage. Showing up at charity auctions with Emily on his arm, posting gym selfies of his own where the weights were more props than tools, tagging every brand, every hashtag, desperate for validation. And I would see those posts float into my feed and think, you can't bench press integrity. You can't buy endurance, and the world will eventually learn that, even if it takes time. Still, the worst sting came mid-February when our mother called, her voice bright like she was reading off a script, telling me Ethan wanted to host a family dinner to make peace. And against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe out of nostalgia. Maybe because a part of me still wanted to believe reconciliation was possible. But when I walked into that dining room, I knew instantly it wasn't about peace, it was about theater. Ethan sat at the head of the table, Emily glowing at his side, the room crowded with cousins and uncles who hadn't spoken to me in months. And he raised a glass of red wine, smirking as he said, "To family, the ones who stick by you, not the ones who bail when it gets tough." And the laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like gravel under tires, and I felt every eye flick to me before darting away, no one daring to defend me. Not even our mother, who kept her gaze glued to her plate, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't dinner, this was trial, and the verdict was already decided. I stayed silent, swallowing the rage like hot coals, and later that night, alone in my car, I scribbled in my notebook, "When they humiliate you in public, you repay them in silence, because silence is the prelude to thunder." It was then I started quietly making calls, not to friends, because friends were scarce, but to contacts from work, people who knew people, asking small questions that didn't raise suspicion, and slowly I pieced together more of Ethan's financial recklessness. I learned the car loan I'd co-signed wasn't his only liability. There were credit cards maxed out, a business partnership that had soured, whispers of unpaid taxes, and suddenly I saw the cracks in the golden child image he paraded around town. Hairline fractures no one noticed because the glare of his spotlight blinded them. But I saw them, and I wrote them down detail by detail, like a surveyor marking fault lines before an earthquake. Yet even as I built my quiet arsenal, Ethan doubled down, as if he sensed my composure as a threat. One Friday night, I stopped by the same bar I'd been going to for years, and as fate would have it, Ethan and Emily walked in minutes later with their entourage, and instead of ignoring me, Ethan strutted over, clapped me on the shoulder like we were buddies, and said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "How's the bachelor life treating you, Danny? Bet it's quieter than you thought, huh?" And the laughter that rippled through the crowd was cheap, rehearsed, but it burned anyway, and I forced a smile, nodding like I didn't care, while inside I cataloged every smirk, every raised eyebrow, every witness, because humiliation is data, and when you remember who laughed, you know who to invite when it's time to return the show. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the receipts spread out in front of me, old loan papers, notes from calls, screenshots of social posts, and as the hours crawled toward dawn, I saw it all connect into something bigger than revenge. It was architecture, and Ethan had already built half the scaffolding himself. I just had to push in the right place to make the whole structure collapse. And the thought steadied me, warmed me, even as exhaustion pulled at my eyes, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing, and preparation is the sharpest form of hope. The weeks after that bar scene were some of the loneliest of my life because humiliation doesn't just sting in the moment, it lingers. It follows you into the grocery store where you notice people glancing a little too long. It trails you at the gym where conversations pause when you walk by, and though no one said it outright, I could feel the narrative shifting in the town's bloodstream. Daniel, the dependable one, the hard worker, the guy who everyone thought would marry Emily and settle down, had been outmaneuvered by his younger brother, who somehow turned betrayal into a performance and pulled the audience to his side. And the shame of it was worse than anger, was suffocating, because silence had become complicity, and the people who knew me best were the ones who said the least. Yet in that silence I found clarity, because shame sharpens memory, and I remembered every dollar I'd loaned Ethan, every signature on a form, every call at 2 a.m. when he begged for help, and I began gathering them, not with desperation but with patience, scanning documents, saving files, treating each piece like a brick for the foundation of something bigger, something inevitable. Ethan, of course, kept performing. He threw an engagement party in late March, renting out the ballroom at the same hotel where Emily and I had once talked about booking our wedding reception. And when the invitation arrived in my mailbox, with my name scribbled as if it were an afterthought, I almost laughed, because I knew it wasn't an invitation. It was bait, another stage for him to hang me out as the punchline. And he did, because when I walked in, dressed simply, no date, just myself, he greeted me with that actor's grin and tapped the microphone, saying, "Glad you could make it, big brother. We saved you a seat near the back. Figured you'd be most comfortable there." The crowd chuckled, not loudly, but enough, and I sat in the shadows, sipping water, watching him spin story after story about his hard work and hustle. The room applauding like they hadn't a clue how shallow the well really was. And instead of bitterness, I felt an almost eerie calm settle over me, because the louder he bragged, the deeper he dug his own hole. And I knew someday soon I'd be the one holding the rope. After that night, I started small casual conversations with mutual acquaintances, subtle questions about Ethan's deals, noting inconsistencies, remembering dates, and slowly, the fog cleared. There were investment pitches that never materialized, checks that bounced, partners who stopped returning his calls. Still, Ethan pressed on, louder than ever, filling the void with noise, and people, being people, kept clapping, because it's easier to believe a lie wrapped in confidence than the truth spoken quietly. But I had time on my side, and patience is a weapon the arrogant never see coming. One evening in April, driving home from work, I passed the old oak tree near the edge of town, the one where Ethan had carved his initials as a teenager, right over mine, as if erasing me was a reflex even back then, and I pulled over, staring at those faded scratches in the bark, the wind rattling through the branches, and it hit me that this wasn't just about Emily, or the loans, or the parties. This was about a lifetime of being overshadowed, rewritten, humiliated, and I whispered to myself, "You carved over me once, Ethan, but this time I'll carve back, and when I do, it'll be permanent." That vow crystallized something inside me. I wouldn't just expose him, I'd orchestrate it so the very stage he used to humiliate me would become his execution ground, and the same audience that clapped for him would watch him fall. And so I returned to my notebooks, my files, my late-night research, turning chaos into strategy, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night, not because the pain was gone, but because I knew it had a purpose. The shift from humiliation to strategy wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the way frost creeps across a window overnight, unseen until morning light reveals the patterns. And that's how I began tightening the noose around Ethan, without him realizing the rope was even there, because arrogance blinds you to quiet movement, and Ethan was as blind as they come. I started with the small threads, pulling bank statements from the shared accounts where I'd once foolishly cosigned, filing away loan records he had begged me to back, and with each late fee and bounced check I unearthed, I could almost hear the rope creaking, slowly, patiently, tightening in silence. I didn't confront him, not once, because confrontation feeds men like Ethan. They thrive on the spectacle, on the chance to turn truth into theater, and I refused to give him that stage again. Instead, I sat in the background of his life, just as he wanted me to, but now my silence wasn't submission, it was strategy, and I used it to listen, to notice, to collect. I'd befriended people he overlooked, the assistants at his office, who noticed he came in late and left early, the bartender at the upscale lounge where he schmoozed investors who never seemed to invest, even Emily's cousin, who once slipped after too many glasses of wine that Ethan had been juggling debts with money that wasn't his, and I stitched every thread into a web, knowing eventually the weight would pull him down. Meanwhile, I kept living my life outwardly, as though nothing had changed, showing up at work, hitting the gym, grabbing beers with the few friends who hadn't deserted me, because the key to setting a trap is normalcy. Predators notice sudden shifts, but they ignore what looks familiar, and Ethan never suspected I was doing anything more than sulking in the shadow he cast. What he didn't realize was that every time he boasted about another big deal on social media, every time he posted a photo in some rented car or beside a house that wasn't his, he was building my case for me, and all I had to do was archive it, back it up, save it for the day the mask came off. Yet there were nights when I doubted myself. Nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, asking whether revenge would really heal anything. But then I'd remember the way he'd grinned when Emily took his hand, the way he'd leaned into the microphone and mocked me in front of hundreds, and the doubt hardened into resolve, because forgiveness is for accidents, not choices, and Ethan's every act had been deliberate. One evening, as spring broke into summer, I drove past the oak tree again, and I noticed how the bark around our old carvings had thickened, swelling, twisting, as if trying to heal over the wounds we'd cut years ago. And it struck me that trees never erase scars. They carry them forward, turning them into part of their strength. And I thought to myself, that's what this will be, not an erasure of the past, but a scar that makes me stronger. From that night on, I redoubled my efforts. I learned about shell companies, about how fraud unravels when money moves faster than accountability. I reached out discreetly to a contact in the bank's compliance office, framing my questions as hypotheticals, and I could tell from the pause in his voice that Ethan's patterns would eventually set off alarms. Still, I never rushed, never pushed, because timing is the difference between a stumble and a collapse, and I wanted collapse. By June, Ethan was louder than ever, parading Emily around at charity galas, toasting his success at fundraisers, while behind the curtain I had compiled enough evidence to bury him in court or the court of public opinion, whichever struck first. And still I waited because the rope wasn't tight enough yet, and when you've been humiliated as completely as I had, patience isn't weakness, it's power. The longer the silence, the sharper the fall. The cracks in Ethan's perfect facade didn't appear all at once. They came in hairline fractures, too small for most people to notice, but to me, watching with the patience of someone who has been burned and now waits for the spark to return, they were glaring, and I catalogued each one like a collector of broken promises. The first was subtle, a missed payment on the flashy car lease that left him stranded at the curb one afternoon while Emily scrolled her phone pretending not to care. But I caught the frustration etched on his face when he thought no one was looking, and I tucked that image away because it showed me that under all the polish, the foundation was starting to rot. The second came when I visited my parents one Sunday, still out of obligation, still trying to navigate the fine line between filial duty and self-preservation, and my father, who had once applauded Ethan's every move, grumbled about mysterious withdrawals from the savings he'd let Ethan manage. And I sat there silently, nodding, sipping my coffee, acting as though I was hearing this for the first time. But inside I felt the rope draw tighter because Ethan had made the fatal mistake of stealing from the very people who would defend him to the end. Betrayal of trust, especially family trust, doesn't just crack relationships, it detonates them. By July, Ethan's arrogance was working in my favor because he never turned down a spotlight, never missed an opportunity to boast, and the more he tried to project success, the more reckless he became behind the scenes, borrowing money from acquaintances, juggling cards, shifting funds in ways that screamed desperation to anyone who knew what signs to look for. I let him believe I was oblivious, even sympathetic, and at one point I sent him a text saying, "Hope everything's good, bro." Not because I cared, but because bait works best when it looks harmless, and he responded with his usual bravado, "Always, man. Bigger deals coming." I smiled when I read it, not because I believed him, but because I knew lies get heavier the longer you carry them, and Ethan was already staggering. Meanwhile, I started quietly networking with attorneys, not the flashy ones Ethan liked to hire for appearances, but the quiet types, the ones who lived in paperwork and loopholes, the ones who smiled when I described a hypothetical case of financial fraud intertwined with breach of trust. And each time one of them nodded knowingly, I felt the floor beneath Ethan give just a little more. But the most telling moment came late one night, when I stopped at the bar near his office, the same place he used for his meetings, and the bartender, who'd grown used to my casual questions, leaned in and whispered, "He's been drinking more, man. Like he's nervous. Like he's hiding something," and I nodded, ordered another beer, and felt the trap's frame solidify in my mind. I knew then it wasn't just about collecting evidence. It was about timing the reveal so perfectly that every mask would fall at once. His finances, his reputation, his marriage, even his standing with our parents, and the beauty of it was that I wouldn't have to push him into the abyss. I'd just have to move the spotlight so everyone else could see the hole he dug. One evening, as I walked past the oak tree again, I noticed a bird had built a nest in one of its gnarled branches, delicate twigs balancing precariously, and I thought about how fragile constructions can be, how one gust of wind could scatter everything. And in that moment, I saw Ethan's empire for what it was, a nest built on lies, balanced too precariously to last, and I promised myself I would be the wind. The hardest part was staying silent, keeping my hands steady when every fiber of me wanted to scream the truth to anyone who'd listen. But restraint became its own kind of power, because I knew every day of his false glory brought him one day closer to the fall. And when it came, no one would say I pushed him, they'd say he jumped. By the time late summer bled into fall, the air sharper, the leaves shifting into that deep red that always reminded me of old wounds. Ethan's downfall wasn't a possibility anymore. It was a schedule, a matter of dates and signatures. And all I had to do was keep him dancing toward the edge without realizing the ground beneath him was already gone. Because arrogance makes men blind, and Ethan had never once looked down to see if his footing was solid. He was too busy posing for the crowd. I had been patient, unbearably patient, collecting the threads that would weave his undoing, and now the net was so tightly knotted that even if he sensed danger, even if he tried to squirm free, the more he moved the tighter it would pull. I started with the small things, the legal whispers that grow into storms when they're given the right kind of attention, quietly compiling bank statements that showed the withdrawals from my parents' accounts, the false promises he'd made to invest their retirement funds into schemes that never materialized, the unpaid loans to friends who were growing restless and bitter. I didn't even need to fabricate anything. Ethan had done the heavy lifting for me. My role was simply to organize the chaos into something undeniable. At the same time, I nurtured the relationships that would matter most when the final act played out. The banker who didn't mind flagging unusual transfers when asked the right questions, the county clerk who pulled records with a raised eyebrow but no hesitation, the attorney who smirked when I slid a folder across his desk, labeled family business, and said, "This is either the easiest case I'll ever watch unravel." And the beauty was that Ethan, oblivious as ever, kept feeding the narrative himself, planning another lavish party, talking about expanding the business, flaunting a Rolex that everyone knew came from money that wasn't his, even cornering me once at my parents' house to brag about how networking with the right people was the key to everything, his grin so smug I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing, because I already knew the right people were the ones quietly handing me the rope he was tying around his own neck. Emily, for her part, was drifting, her smile tighter, her presence beside him more forced, and I wondered if she'd realized yet that the security she'd chased was made of sand, that the man she'd chosen was cracking faster than he could patch himself together. But I didn't pity her, not anymore. She'd made her choice, and when the storm came, she'd be standing beside him, not me. The symbolic weight of the oak tree never left me during those months. I walked past it often, its bark scarred, its branches twisting defiantly, and I thought about how storms don't topple a tree in a single gust. They weaken it over time, splitting the core, until the final push sends it crashing. And Ethan was that tree, hollowed by his own greed, waiting for the wind. I became that wind by planting one final seed. A rumor, just quiet enough to seem accidental, that Ethan's business was being looked into. Nothing concrete, just a whispered suggestion dropped in the right ears, because reputation is fragile, and once people start to doubt, they watch closer. The truth becomes impossible to hide. Ethan, in his desperation to protect the image he worshipped, only accelerated the process, signing deals he couldn't cover, taking loans he couldn't repay, even begging for a favor from one of the same bankers who had already aligned with me. And I knew then that he wasn't just trapped, he was begging for the cage to close. Every step he took, every lie he told, every desperate gesture, it all tightened the noose, and by the end of September I had the entire case file sitting neatly in my drawer. Financial fraud, breach of trust, falsified statements, personal testimonies lined up like dominoes, all waiting for the touch that would send them toppling. But I didn't act yet, because the reveal needed to be perfect, poetic, undeniable. It had to be the kind of fall that left no doubt about why it happened, no way for Ethan to spin it. No way for my parents to say it was bad luck or just a mistake. They needed to see, with their own eyes, the truth of who their golden son really was. And that meant waiting for the biggest stage, the brightest lights, the crowd that Ethan himself would invite, thinking it would crown him king, not realizing it would be his gallows. And so, as the leaves finally began to fall from the oak tree, scattering across the sidewalk in crimson and gold, I told myself, soon, very soon, the waiting will end, and when it does, Ethan won't even know he walked into it until the trap slams shut around him. Ethan always did love spectacles, so it didn't surprise me when the invitation came printed on heavy ivory stock with gold lettering, embossed with a crest he'd designed for himself as if he were some kind of royalty, declaring the night would be a celebration of family, legacy, and the bright future ahead, which was laughable in a way that almost made me choke when I first read it. Because I already knew the only legacy he'd be leaving behind would be a trail of ruin and shame, but still I RSVP'd without hesitation. because this was it. This was the stage he had built with his own hands, thinking it would lift him higher, not realizing he'd built it over a sinkhole, and I would be there to watch him fall straight through. The night of the gala, if you could even call it that, arrived crisp and clear, the city lights shimmering against the autumn air, and as I pulled up in my car, parking beneath the glow of the venue's tall glass windows, I felt the kind of steady calm that only comes when you've already played the game 1,000 times in your head, every move rehearsed, every outcome secured. Inside, the place was as ostentatious as I expected. Chandeliers dripping crystal like frozen rain, tables lined with linen so white it hurt the eyes, waiters gliding by with champagne flutes that caught the light, and everywhere, Ethan's fingerprints, the massive banner with his company's name, the slideshow of photos playing on giant screens, him shaking hands. Him at ribbon cuttings, him holding court like a king, and at the center of it all, Ethan himself, grinning too wide, too tight, his tuxedo immaculate, Emily at his side looking like she'd been carved from ice. My parents were there too, of course, beaming with pride, my mother clinging to Ethan's arm as if her approval could shield him from the storm barreling his way, my father's handshake firm but distracted, already drifting toward the men with cigars who promised influence. And me? I blended in, shaking hands, smiling politely, but every time I looked at Ethan I saw not the man in front of me, but the boy from years ago under the oak tree, his fingers snapping the branch with a cruel smirk, declaring himself the real son. While I swallowed the pain and buried it deep, waiting for this moment when I would no longer have to hide. As the evening unfolded, I noticed the whispers starting like a draft under adore subtle glances between bankers, raised brows when Ethan mentioned new expansions, chuckles muffled into napkins as his speech grew more grandiose, and I realized the rumor I had seeded months ago had done its job. People weren't coming here to be dazzled anymore. They were coming to see if the glitter could hide the cracks, and the cracks were widening with every boastful word he uttered. Ethan didn't see it, of course, not yet. His arrogance was too thick, his confidence too rehearsed. But I could see the storm gathering in the corner of the room, in the way investors excused themselves to take phone calls, in the way Emily's smile wavered when one of her friends whispered something into her ear, in the way my parents clutched their champagne glasses tighter when they caught sight of a man in a tailored suit they didn't recognize, the attorney I'd invited, who lingered at the edge of the crowd like a shadow, waiting for the cue. And through it all I stood still, my breathing steady, my expression unreadable, because this wasn't about vengeance boiling over in rage. This was about the kind of justice that arrives so silently you don't even hear it until it's already wrapped around you. And I thought of the oak tree again, how storms don't topple them all at once. They bend and bend until suddenly they snap, and I knew that tonight, beneath the chandeliers and the hollow applause, Ethan's roots would give way. Ethan tapped his glass with the confidence of a man convinced the room still belonged to him, his voice booming across the hall as he thanked the loyal friends, family, and partners who made this journey possible. Slipping into the kind of speech he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in front of the mirror, all cadence and empty charm, while I watched from the back, knowing that within minutes every syllable would taste like ash in his mouth, and when he raised his hand dramatically to toast the future of our family legacy. The attorney I'd invited stepped forward with quiet authority, his polished shoes echoing against marble, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm, and for the first time all night I saw Ethan falter, just slightly, a twitch in his smile, a flicker in his eyes, but it was enough. "Before we toast," the attorney said, his voice smooth but sharp, "there are matters of transparency that must be addressed." And suddenly the room shifted, champagne glasses lowered, chairs creaked, laughter died mid-breath, because no one interrupts a man like Ethan at his own coronation, unless the interruption is heavier than the crown itself. The attorney laid out the documents on a table meant for canapes, each page sliding out like a blade. Proof of falsified ledgers, forged signatures, shell companies, siphoning funds, investments built on nothing but smoke. Gasps cut through the silence, whispers surged like a tide, and Ethan's smile cracked into something jagged and desperate as he stammered, This is slander, lies, all lies." But the more he shouted, the more the room pulled away, eyes narrowing, friends becoming strangers. Emily clutched her clutch so tight her knuckles whitened, her gaze darting toward the exits, as if already calculating escape routes, while my mother whispered Ethan's name under her breath like a prayer. My father's jaw set hard, his face drained of color, both of them looking at me as if somehow I could fix this, but I didn't move. I didn't speak, I just let the storm roll. Ethan tried to turn the tide, pointing at me with trembling fury, spitting, "He did this. He's jealous, he's been plotting against me since we were kids." And in that moment, the entire crowd turned their eyes toward me, waiting, weighing, but I simply met Ethan's gaze and shook my head slowly, calmly, like a man who doesn't need to shout to be heard, and that silence spoke louder than anything he could scream. The attorney continued, methodical, undeniable, showing emails, bank transfers, affidavits, every piece falling into place like dominoes, and with each one, Ethan's empire crumbled a little more, the proud scaffolding of his life exposed as rotten wood. Investors excused themselves, their chairs scraping coldly against the floor, whispers rising now not in curiosity but in condemnation, words like fraud, ruin, lawsuit, rippling through the hall until it felt less like a gala and more like a courtroom. Ethan slammed his fist on the podium, veins bulging in his neck, shouting about loyalty, about betrayal, but no one was listening anymore. His voice drowned beneath the tide he could no longer command. And I thought back to that night years ago under the oak tree, his words, the real sun, echoing against my ribs, and I realized that here, now, in this glittering hall where he sought to crown himself king, his kingdom had turned to dust before his eyes. Ethan's voice cracked as he shouted about conspiracies and betrayal, but what cut deeper than any document the attorney laid out was the sudden scrape of Emily's heels as she stepped back from his side, her face pale yet calculated, lips pressed into a thin line as she whispered something to a friend near the door before quietly excusing herself from the disaster unraveling at center stage. And the silence of her departure was deafening because everyone knew what it meant. The woman who once clung to his arm for status had judged the empire unsalvageable and was already cutting her losses, leaving Ethan mid-sentence, sputtering, his hands outstretched toward the empty space where she'd stood, his words falling apart into half-broken pleas. My parents looked on in frozen disbelief, my mother clutching her necklace so tightly it left imprints in her skin, my father's lips pressed into a grim line, and for the first time in my life I saw recognition in their eyes. Not pride, not affection, but the dawning realization that the son they'd held up on a pedestal was nothing more than a hollow idol, and the son they dismissed had been quietly carrying the weight of the family's integrity all along. Ethan, frantic, turned on them next. Tell them I'm not the villain here!" But their silence hung heavier than any verdict, their shame settling like lead across the hall, and in that silence I finally stepped forward, not to shout or gloat, but to speak with the calm finality of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. "This isn't about jealousy," I said evenly, my voice carrying across the room. "This is about truth, and the truth has a way of finding daylight, no matter how deep you bury it." The attorney nodded, sliding the last set of papers across the table, my final safeguard, the hidden trap evidence that not only was I uninvolved in Ethan's crimes, but that every attempt he made to drag my name through the mud had been preemptively blocked by legal walls I'd been building for years, quiet as roots beneath the soil, until tonight when they finally held strong against the storm. Ethan staggered back as he read, his bravado collapsing, his shoulders hunched like a man decades older, and when he looked up at me there was no fury left, only a hollow sort of pleading, a silent question of whether I would offer a hand to pull him from the wreckage. But I didn't move, because I remembered that night beneath the oak tree, his words like knives, the real son. And I understood now that leaving him to stand alone in the ruins of his own making was the only justice that could ever balance the scales. Guests filed out one by one, their laughter gone, their loyalty dissolved, until the grand hall that had once felt too small for Ethan's ego now felt cavernous and empty, his kingdom reduced to echoes and shadows. As I walked out into the night, the air cool against my face, I paused beneath the old oak at the edge of the property, its branches twisting upward like scars etched into the sky, and I laid my hand against its bark, feeling the weight of years press into my palm. And I realized that the boy who once stood here, humiliated, had grown into the man who walked away unbroken, while the brother who once called himself the real son was now nothing but a hollow echo fading in the silence, his legacy rotting at the roots. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.